Welcome to today's episode of the Deep Dive Credit Podcast, presented by Elite Credit Solutions. We are your trusted partner in affordable credit repair, proudly based in Tampa, Florida, and dedicated to serving clients across the entire United States. Join us as we explore the intricacies of credit management, share expert insights, and empower you with the knowledge you need to achieve your financial goals. Get ready for an enlightening journey into the world of credit. Let's dive in.
Back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that's not exactly a party topic, but it's really important. We're talking about what happens to car loans after death.
Yeah, it's one of those things that most people don't really want to think about, but it's something that we all need to be aware of.
Absolutely. And you've sent over a ton of articles on this topic, so it seems like you're ready to dive in. We've got articles from financial experts like MoneyFit and Experian, guidance from Progressive Insurance, and even a piece from a Toyota dealership.
Wow, yeah, you've really done your research. It sounds like you're ready to get into the details.
Definitely. So let's start with the basics. What happens to a car loan when the owner passes away? Like, does it just disappear?
Unfortunately, no. It would be nice if things worked that way, but that debt actually becomes part of the deceased person's estate.
Okay, so the estate. For those of us who aren't, lawyers or financial experts, can you break down what exactly an estate is?
Sure. Think of it like a financial inventory of everything the person owned and owed at the time of their death. So that includes things like their house, savings accounts, and yes, any outstanding debts like that car loan.
So it all gets kind of lumped together.
Exactly. And the estate is responsible for settling those debts before anything can be distributed to the heirs.
That makes sense. But what if the estate doesn't have enough money to cover the loan? I noticed a few of these articles mentioned something called a death clause in loan contracts.
Ah, yes, the death clause. This is where things can get a little tricky. Basically, this clause outlines what happens to the loan when the borrower dies.
So, who's responsible for paying it off?
Exactly. It might specify that the estate is responsible, or it could shift the responsibility to a cosigner if there is one. It also usually lays out the consequences if the loan isn't paid.
And some of those consequences can be pretty serious, right? I know MoneyFit and Toyota of Madison both mentioned that the lender could actually repossess the car.
That's right. And it can happen even if the car was left to someone in the will. Imagine dealing with that while you're grieving. It's not something anyone wants to go through.
Absolutely. So it sounds like understanding these death clauses is really crucial.
Definitely. And it's important to remember that different lenders might have different policies. Some might have grace periods for notifying them or options for assuming the loan, so it's always best to contact the lender directly and see what their specific procedures are.
Speaking of assuming the loan, Capital One Auto Navigator had a really interesting example of how inheriting a car doesn't automatically mean you inherit the debt. But if there's a cosigner on that loan, things can get a bit more complicated.
Yeah, the cosigner situation is a big one. When you cosign a loan, you're essentially agreeing to be equally responsible for that debt. So if the estate can't pay, the lender can come after the cosigner for the full amount.
That makes me wonder, are there any situations where a family member who isn't a cosigner would be responsible for the car loan?
There are a few scenarios where that might happen. Certain states have what are called community property laws, and those can complicate things.
Community property. That rings a bell, but I can't quite remember what it means. Can you refresh my memory?
Of course. Basically, in community property states, any assets and debts acquired during the marriage are considered to be owned equally by both spouses.
So even if my name isn't on the car loan, but my spouse got the loan while we were married, I could still be on the hook for it.
That's right. Even if your name isn't on the loan documents, you could still be held liable because it's considered a shared debt. This is especially common in states like California and Texas.
Wow, that's really important to know. I had no idea.
Yeah, a lot of people are surprised by this. It's why understanding the specifics of your state's laws is crucial in these situations.
So it's not just about what's in the loan documents, but also the laws of the state where you live.
Exactly. It can get complicated pretty quickly, so it's always a good idea to consult with an attorney or financial advisor if you have any questions.
Good advice. It sounds like inheriting a car isn't always as simple as just getting the keys. So let's say someone I asked left a car in a will. Do they automatically get it free and clear?
That's where it can get a little tricky again. Inheriting the car doesn't automatically erase the debt attached to it.
So even though they've inherited the car, they might still have to deal with that loan.
Right. The estate still needs to settle that loan with the lender. If they don't, the lender could repossess the car even from the person who inherited it.
So what are the options in that situation? Could the person who inherits the car just assume the existing loan?
Assuming the loan is definitely a possibility. Sometimes it can even be a good financial decision, especially if the original loan had a favorable interest rate. It's often cheaper than getting a new loan.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I'm guessing there are some hoops to jump through.
There usually are. The person inheriting the car would need to meet the lender's requirements and be approved to take over the payments.
So things like a credit check and proof of income.
Exactly. The lender wants to make sure the person taking over the loan is financially capable of handling the payments.
Makes perfect sense. Now, MoneyFit mentioned something that I found really interesting. They talked about credit life insurance. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yes. Credit life insurance can be a lifesaver in these situations.
Really? How does it work?
Basically, it's a type of insurance that's specifically designed to pay off a loan balance if the borrower dies.
So it takes care of the debt and prevents it from becoming a burden on the family.
Exactly. It can really provide a lot of peace of mind.
That's great to know. I have to admit, I'd never really thought about credit life insurance before, but it sounds like something worth looking into.
It definitely is, especially if you have any outstanding loans. You might already have it and not even realize it. It's often offered as an option when you take out a loan.
Oh, interesting. Maybe I should check my paperwork.
It's always a good idea to review your loan documents and see what kind of coverage you have.
This whole conversation has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's not just about what happens after someone passes away, but also about taking steps now to protect ourselves and our families.
You're absolutely right. Knowing this information can empower you to make informed decisions, avoid potential pitfalls, and have those important conversations with your loved ones.
I couldn't agree more. Speaking of those tricky conversations, we should probably talk about leased cars. Those seem to add another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Leases definitely have their own set of rules and considerations.
Yeah, that's where I started to get a little lost. Do all the same rules apply to leased vehicles as they do to financed vehicles?
Some of the same principles apply, but there are some key differences. For example, with a leased car, the cosigner or the estate would still be responsible for managing the lease, but the options might be a bit different.
Different how?
Well, instead of paying off a remaining loan balance, they might be looking at terminating the lease, transferring it to someone else, or continuing to make the payments.
So there's even more to consider when it comes to a leased car.
Exactly. Lease agreements tend to be very specific, and they often outline very clear procedures for handling the lease in the event of the lessee's death. It's important to read those agreements carefully and understand your options.
This is all incredibly helpful. You've given me a lot to think about, both for my own situation and for helping my family. Before we move on, I just want to make sure we highlight one key takeaway for our listeners.
I think the most important thing to remember is that a car loan, or a lease for that matter, doesn't just magically disappear when the owner passes away. These are debts that become part of the deceased's estate. And understanding your rights and responsibilities in these situations is absolutely crucial.
So whether you're thinking about your own future or helping loved ones navigate this tricky terrain, knowledge is power.
Absolutely. It allows you to make informed decisions, avoid potential pitfalls, and hopefully minimize the stress during what's already a difficult time.
So true. Now, for our listener out there, knowing what we've discussed today, are there any conversations you need to have with your family or any considerations for your own estate planning? Take a moment to think about that, and we'll come back to it in just a bit. But first, let's take a deeper dive into the world of leases. What happens to those agreements when the leaseholder passes away? We'll explore all the intricacies of those contracts and highlight some key differences between handling leases versus loans. Stay tuned.
It's a topic that's becoming more and more relevant as more and more people choose to lease their vehicles. So we'll break it down and offer some practical advice on how to navigate this sometimes overlooked part of estate planning.
Sounds good to me. Let's get started.
All right, so let's dive into those leases. As we mentioned earlier, lease agreements can be pretty specific, especially when it comes to what happens if the person leasing the car, the lessee, passes away.
Yeah, you're right. I know with loans, there's often that option of assuming the debt, but does that even apply to leases?
Well, it can, but it's not as common. It really depends on the leasing company and their specific policies.
Oh, so some companies might be okay with it and others might not.
Yeah, exactly. Some leasing companies might allow a family member or a beneficiary to take over the lease, but they'll usually have a pretty strict set of requirements.
I can imagine. They'd want to make sure that whoever's taking over the lease is actually able to make the payments, right?
Exactly. And they're also going to look at things like how much time is left on the lease and what kind of shape the car is in. If there's a lot of wear and tear or the mileage is way over the limit, they might be less likely to allow a transfer.
So it's not just about inheriting the car. It's about inheriting the entire lease agreement and all those terms and conditions.
That's a great way to put it. And those terms and conditions, well, they can be all over the place. They vary a lot from one leasing company to another. So it's always a good idea to really take a look at that lease agreement, read through it carefully, and make sure you understand what the options are if the lessee passes away.
Now, one of the articles I read, I think it's from Progressive, mentioned something about penalties for ending a lease early. Is that something to be concerned about in these situations?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Most leases have these clauses, these early termination fees, and let me tell you, they can be pretty hefty sometimes.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's basically the leasing company's way of making sure they don't lose a bunch of money if the lease gets cut short.
So how do they even calculate those fees?
Well, it varies, but it usually involves looking at the remaining lease payments, how much the car is worth, its residual value, and any other penalties that might apply. It can get pretty complicated.
It sounds like it. And I imagine that could add a lot of stress and financial burden on top of everything else.
It definitely can. And that's why it's so important to understand these nuances about leases, especially when you're thinking about estate planning or helping a loved one make these decisions.
Well, it definitely seems like being prepared is key here. Are there any steps you'd recommend for someone who's currently leasing a car?
The first thing I would say is to pull out that lease agreement and read through it really carefully.
Just dive right in.
Yeah. Pay close attention to those sections about death or incapacitation, See if it outlines any specific procedures to follow or who to contact at the leasing company.
Great starting point. I always feel better when I'm prepared, don't you?
Absolutely. And another thing you can do is have a conversation with your family, your loved ones. Let them know about the lease, where to find that agreement if something happens to you, and what their options might be.
I know those conversations can be tough, but ultimately it's about making things easier for the people you care about.
Exactly. You're taking away the guesswork and giving them a roadmap to follow during a potentially really stressful time. And while you're at it, you might even think about designating a specific person to handle the lease, in your will or estate plan.
That's a great idea. It's streamline the process and make sure someone you trust is making those decisions.
Precisely. And speaking of streamlining, another thing that can help is keeping all your important documents organized and easy to find.
Like what kind of documents?
Well, not just the lease agreement itself, but also things like insurance policies, registration information, any letters or emails you've gotten from the leasing company, anything related to the lease.
I know what you mean. Sometimes those documents have a way of disappearing just when you need them the most.
Oh, I hear that. So having a designated folder or even just a digital file with all that information, it can really save a lot of headaches later on. And, one last thought I'll add. Remember, communication is key throughout this whole process.
Talking to family, you mean?
Well, yeah, but also communicating with the leasing company.
Oh, right. Makes sense.
Don't hesitate to reach out to them, if you have any questions or concerns. They can give you some guidance on what the procedures are, what fees you might be looking at, and what your options are. They deal with this stuff all the time, and they're usually pretty willing to work with you to find a solution that makes sense.
That's good to know. It's definitely reassuring to know there's someone you can turn to for help.
And just remember, every lease agreement is different, so it's always best to go straight to the source. Check with the leasing company directly to get the most accurate and up-to-date information.
Makes sense. I think we've covered a lot of ground on leases. Anything else we should touch on before we get back to our listener?
I think we've hit the main points. Just remember, when in doubt, reach out to the leasing company. They're there to help.
Great advice. Now, I'm eager to hear what our listener has been thinking about. We posed that thought-provoking question earlier, and I'm curious to hear their insights. So, listener, are you ready to share? All right, so let's circle back to that question we asked earlier. The one about whether this deep dive has sparked any thoughts about conversations you need to have with your family or any considerations for your own estate planning.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear what's been going through our listeners' mind. I know these aren't always easy topics to think about, but they're so important.
Absolutely. Sometimes just knowing where to start can be the hardest part. So listener, what's been resonating with you? What's really stood out from our conversation today?
Maybe you're thinking about those cosigner responsibilities we talked about. Like maybe it's time to have a chat with your parents about that loan you cosigned for them. Or maybe you need to sit down with your siblings and figure out who's responsible for what if something happens to one of you.
Or maybe you live in one of those community property states and you're realizing you need to really understand how those laws could affect you. It might be time to take another look at your estate plan with a lawyer, or even create one if you don't have one already.
Those are all really good points. And remember, it's not just about protecting yourself. It's about making sure your loved ones are taken care of too.
That's so true. We've covered a lot of complex information today, but I really hope our listener is feeling more empowered than overwhelmed. Just having a plan in place can make a world of difference when it comes to these kinds of sensitive situations.
It's like having a flashlight in a dark room, Suddenly you can see where you're going.
I love that. And speaking of navigating, if you want to dig deeper into this topic, don't forget to check out our show notes. We've got links to all those resources we mentioned so you can explore at your own pace.
Consider it your toolkit for, tackling this often overlooked but super important part of financial planning.
Well, I think we've successfully illuminated the sometimes murky world of auto loans and leases after death. Mm-hmm. It might not be the most cheerful topic, but hopefully we've given you some clarity and helped you feel more confident about making those important decisions.
Exactly. Remember, knowledge is power. And having this knowledge means you can approach these situations with a clear head and a compassionate heart, both for yourself and for the people you care about.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
No.
Until next time, keep diving deep, and we'll catch you on the next episode of The Deep Dive.
That wraps up another insightful episode of the Deep Dive Credit Podcast, brought to you by Elite Credit Solutions, your go-to resource for affordable credit repair across the United States. We appreciate you joining us today, and we hope you found the information valuable and empowering. If you're ready to take control of your financial future, don't hesitate to reach out to us at 813-317-6776. Additionally, don't forget to like today's podcast, share with your friends on social media, follow us, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay in tune with future updates. Thank you for listening. And until next time, keep striving for excellence in your credit journey.